I used to believe that silence could keep a family stitched together, that if I folded my needs small enough and tucked them in the back of a drawer, the people I loved would stop noticing every fault and simply love me back. That belief died the afternoon boiling water exploded across my forearm and turned my skin into a map of screaming heat. The sound wasn't my voice, not at first. It was the vicious hiss of liquid meeting flesh, a whistle of betrayal, as if each tiny cell cried out for itself. The kitchen blurred. The peeling linoleum and humming refrigerator fell away, and the sun at the window became a cold, white hole. Then my son's voice arrived hard and efficient, slicing through the pain like a surgeon who didn't care if the patient lived. He said maybe that would shut me up for good, said it without rage, without even heat, said it, like a man swatting a fly that kept returning to the same window. Chloe, his wife, looked past the blisters rising on my arm to the puddle on the floor and announced I had made a mess she would now have to mop, as if the water had boiled itself, and jumped at me for dramatic effect. She said I did it to myself. She said I was always stirring the pot, always needing attention, a charity case tucked under their roof out of reluctant duty. I tried to gather air to answer and found only a thin thread of breath. The one person I wanted to look at, my grandson, sat silent and still at his tiny table, with both hands wrapped around a carton of apple juice. The straw unpierced his eyes too wide for any child. I had read stories to those eyes, taught them the names of birds, counted the moths that came to the porch light. I couldn't say it was all right. It wasn't. I rose without words, fingers biting the counter I had once chosen with my husband, a slab of granite as cold as the tone my son had used. I walked out while they watched the floor. No one followed me, not even to argue, not even to make a show of it. I passed the armchair where my grandson had fallen asleep, with his head heavy against my collarbone. I passed the hallway mark that announced the height of a laughing 10-year-old boy who used to burst through the door with skinned elbows and demand I look. The word mama used to be a prayer in his mouth. Somewhere along the way, it became a traffic signal he ignored. I closed the small guest room door and turned the lock a soft click that sounded like a gavel. I slid down the wood and listened to the thud of my heart and the throb in my arm, and in that tight, quiet clarity rose. They wanted me gone. In the demand was a gift. I hadn't expected permission to stop pretending I didn't own the very roof that hid them from the rain. I have always been a woman who keeps paper. When my husband Arthur was still alive, he teased me gently about my folders and labels and neat receipts, the tidy trail of a life paid for, with overtime, with careful groceries, with coffee brewed at home. Beneath his sweaters in the cedar chest at the foot of my bed lay a slim leather portfolio that had not seen daylight in years. I lifted the lid, and there it was, the title deed to the Port Blossom House dated 1989, embossed with the county seal. My name, Eleanora Vance, pressed into it the way a signet ring marks wax. Sole owner. We had done it that way for reasons that seemed practical then and turned prophetic later. The mill was dangerous, and my nursing job carried steadier benefits and steadier hours. Arthur always said the home would rest in the hands of the person who knew how to protect it. But after he died, I allowed grief to unmake my sense. I made myself smaller so Julian and Chloe could move through rooms like they were born to them. I moved into the smallest bedroom and treated my presence as a courtesy we extended to ourselves. I became the cook, the cleaner, the one who warmed bottles and wiped counters and slipped my own plate to the edge of the table to make space for all their plates. When Chloe began to refer to me in the third person while I stood 2 feet away, "Can you tell her not to use the guest towels?" Something in me bent around the remark like a paperclip bending around force. Earlier that day, she had told me the bathroom smelled like old books and I had promised to open a window and lay a dish of baking soda on the shelf, as if the scent of a life well lived could be scrubbed off tile. I kept telling myself it would even out, that a house has seasons like a year does that winter gives way to warmth. Pain teaches you what month it is more clearly than a calendar. It was deep winter when the saucepan tipped. The decision came like a clean wind, not to vanish, not to beg, not to destroy the parts of me still capable of softness. I would leave, yes, but I would not leave empty. I would take what was mine, and I would give it a purpose larger than their contempt. I packed the soft things first, the ones that don't clatter cotton tees, a cardigan that still smelled faintly of the lavender sachets Arthur's mother used to sew. I slipped our photograph into the side pocket, the one from our 30th anniversary taken by a waitress who apologized for cutting off our feet. I left behind the big pieces of furniture because I knew what a sheriff's notice can compel and what it cannot touch. Paper matters. Keys matter. Names on tax receipts matter. Trauma would like you to forget these truths. It would like you to collapse under the size of feeling so you never stand tall enough to reach the file shelf. I put the deed in my bag, wrapped my burned arm in a clean towel, and stepped into the cool Oregon night. The damp smelled of cedar and tide and distance. No one called after me. The door closed softly behind me, reluctant to give them the slam they deserved. The bus shuddered along the coastal highway, its windows fogging and clearing with each breath of the sea. I was a parcel inside it, wrapped in silence destination, marked in ink only I could read. The cottage at Cedar Creek had waited 2 decades under a thin drift of dust and branches, the key still hidden under the 3rd terracotta pot, where my fingers had placed it in another life. It welcomed me like old linen welcomes a careful hand, the air tasting of cold wood and dried herbs and a faint memory of soap. The furniture wore white sheets like shy ghosts. I took the coverings off one by one, folded them into tidy squares, and stacked them in the closet as if I were opening a little inn. The bed sighed when I sat the mattress, remembering my shape. I listened to wind move through the cedars and traced the old nail in the windowsill that snagged sweaters, the one Arthur always said he'd remove and never did, because life is full of bigger splinters you don't expect. That first night was a long winter river. I slept in pieces and woke in pieces, and each time I turned over, my arm reminded me what had happened with a hot pulse. In the morning, a small ritual returned me to myself. I boiled water on the cottage stove and made coffee in the dented metal pot we bought at a yard sale, while Arthur laughed about how the woman selling it had tried to convince us the dent added character. The first sip steadied my hands. Behind the hanging row of Arthur's old flannel shirts in the wardrobe, a small, fireproof safe opened under my fingers like a prayer box. The combination lived where grief cannot erase it, in the body, in the wrist and knuckles, in the muscle memory of a wife who had spun it open 100 times when life still made sense. Inside lay the deed to the cottage, the tax receipts for land we paid for, with weekends and sore backs, and the passbook records for an account no one but me knew. 22 years of small deposits can look like a mistake if you glance once. Line them up and they become a staircase. My name stood at the top of every page. There are people who think a quiet woman is a weak woman. If they listened closely, they would hear the hum behind the silence, the way a hive hums when the bees are inside doing the work honey requires. I dialed a number I hadn't touched in 15 years, expecting an operator to inform me it had been disconnected or redirected to someone with a new name and a new life who had no use for an old friend. Instead, I heard a crisp, professional voice announce itself, and then break open into an astonished warmth at the sound of mine. Isabel had been Ruth when we were nursing students sneaking French fries in the cafeteria, throwing our caps on a bench and talking about the women we would become when we were old. and finally allowed to be honest. Somewhere between then and now, she changed her name and her field. She went to law school the way a woman trains for a hurricane. She said she specialized in elder rights, as if those two words, elder and rights, had always belonged together, and we were the first generation to say so out loud. When I began to apologize for the hour, for the distance, for having disappeared into my son's household without a forwarding address to my own self, she cut me off with a sentence that wrapped an arm around my shoulders and a sword around my waist. "You don't need a lawyer," she said. "You need a friend with a law degree." 3 days later, she pulled into my gravel drive in a sensible car that had seen more courthouse parking lots than beaches. She wore a blazer-like armor and jeans, like she kept her feet on the ground by choice. She hugged me long enough to hear my bones, and then sat at my small kitchen table with a legal pad, the color of lemons, and a pen that looked heavy enough to sign treaties. I laid out the things that never lied: the deed to the Port Blossom house, the deed to the cottage, tax receipts, utility bills, proof of insurance, the bank account statements that told a story of discipline and secrecy. Finally, I pulled back the towel and showed her my arm. The burn was a raw and weeping geography, a red country bordered by an ugly gauze of purple. She didn't gasp. She didn't tell me to calm down or to be reasonable. The anger that settled on her face was not a storm. It was winter ground hard, and sure, the kind you can build on. She called what happened by its name: assault, elder abuse. She said we would not merely reclaim a house, we would correct a record. She said the world had treated my love like a waiver of rights, and that paper could remind it otherwise. We drove to the courthouse in Lincoln County with my papers in a neat file, and Isabel's confidence wrapped around my shoulders like a proper coat. I signed the petition to evict with a hand that didn't shake. I wrote my name in full: Eleanor Vance, the name on the deed, the name on the hospital badge I wore for 30 years, the name on the birth certificate of the boy who once skinned his knees and ran to me as if bleeding could be fixed by breath alone. We filed the notice and stepped back into a day so clear the cedars looked like they had been scrubbed, so cold the air chastened the inside of your lungs. I did not feel cruel. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tall. I felt like I had remembered how to stand in my own height and not apologize for the view. The sheriff would serve the papers. The calendar would turn. The house would empty itself of people who had mistaken dominion for ownership. There was nothing left to do that hour but return to the cottage and sit with the kind of quiet that makes space, not the kind that suffocates. The phone rang 6 days later. I watched it ring the first 3 times and let it talk to itself. The 4th time, I lifted the receiver and said nothing. The voice on the other end was raw wire, thick with outrage, and then with something that pretended to be sorrow. He asked what the hell I thought I was doing. He swore he would never forgive me. He said I couldn't throw family out on the street. He called me Mom on the second breath, as if the word could rearrange the law, or the truth, or the shape of my heart. When begging didn't work, he threatened. When threats exhausted him, he promised change. When promises felt thin to his own ears, he tried to sound like a child again. Every sentence arrived 15 years late. I did not raise my voice. I did not compete. I listened until the line went as quiet as snow, and then I set the receiver gently back into its cradle. The world didn't end. The kitchen clock continued its little work. Somewhere in Port Blossom, a piece of paper in his hand announced a deadline that would be met whether he packed in anger or in shame. I went to the porch and watched wind comb the trees and understood that grief can be a kind of weather. But there is always a season after the worst of it. I didn't know then that the house would one day shelter women whose names I didn't yet know, that the rooms I had polished would cradle sleep loosened by safety, that the dining table would hold teacups and legal brochures and small, brave plans spoken aloud for the first time. I only knew that the roof was mine again, and that I did not want the echo of their cruelty to be the last sound it ever heard. I only knew that I had spent years handing out plates and being handed contempt, and that I was ready to hand out something else. The decision began to take shape without fanfare, the way bread dough rises under a cloth you forgot to peek beneath. I would not sell the house for money I did not need as much as I needed air. I would not move back into it and walk through haunted hallways wearing new paint. I would turn a place of humiliation into a place of refuge, because I wanted proof that alchemy was not just a story about metals. It was a story about women. That night before I slept, I placed the two deeds side by side on the table and looked at my name spelled the same way on both a bridge between past and future drawn in ink. I whispered a thank you to the woman I had been the one who saved and kept paper and hid keys under terracotta and promised not to waste what she had protected. Then I turned off the lamp and let darkness come like something honest. Not a threat, just a room without light waiting to be lit again. The sheriff's notice had 30 days stamped across it in letters that looked heavier than they were. In reality, it took less time than that for Julian and Chloe to unravel. Isabel told me later that they left in a storm of slammed doors and bitter muttering, leaving behind boxes of forgotten clothing and piles of things they never truly cared about. Entitlement does not pack neatly. It spills, it breaks it, expects someone else to sweep. 2 deputies stood by as neighbors watched from windows, and I imagined whispers carrying through hedges about how the Vances had been evicted by their own mother. Let them whisper. For years, I had been the whisper, the background noise. Now, I was the subject, and the story belonged to me. I did not step foot inside the house again. The memories there were too loud, a chorus of contempt, replaying itself in every corner. But absence is not always loss. I gave the house to a local nonprofit, one that worked with elderly women displaced by family or circumstance, women who had been told they were burdens, who had nowhere safe to sleep. The director's voice trembled when I explained what I wanted. She asked if I understood the gift. I told her I did. The gift was mine as much as theirs, because reclamation is a two-way street. Within weeks, the house transformed. Clean sheets, stocked cupboards, repaired locks, warmth radiating through vents that once carried only arguments. When the first resident arrived, a woman with arthritis and eyes ringed with exhaustion, I handed her the keys. She cried at the sight of heat coming from the vents. I told her no one would ever raise their voice at her there. She nodded as if I had spoken a miracle. I realized then that what I had built was not revenge, but sanctuary. I carved a sign from redwood and hung it on the gate. The haven, a promise that cruelty could not have the last word. While the house became something new, I stayed in the cedar cottage and learned how to belong to myself again. Each morning, I made coffee in the dented pot and sat on the porch, listening to the wind moving through the trees. I began tending the overgrown garden, pulling weeds, until my hands ached, planting bulbs Arthur and I had once dreamed of seeing bloom. The soil gave back patience. The quiet of Cedar Creek was different from the suffocating silence of Port Blossom. It was alive, humming with insects and birds carrying secrets of roots and rain. I rediscovered my own rhythms, morning walks to the post office, afternoons, reading novels I had bought, and never opened evenings, writing letters to myself as if I were a friend. Sometimes loneliness pressed against the windows, but it never broke in. For the first time in years, I locked the door at night, not out of fear, but habit. Julian called once more. This time, he did not shout. His voice cracked under the weight of disbelief, asking how I could do this to him, reminding me of every dollar he believed he was owed, every sacrifice he claimed to have made. He told me Chloe was miserable, that Arya missed me. I nearly broke at the mention of my grandson, but Isabel had warned me, guilt is the oldest trap. I told Julian he knew where to find me if he ever wanted to talk like a son instead of a landlord, and then I ended the call. He never came. Some nights I wondered about Arya's eyes, whether they searched for me, whether he asked questions his parents couldn't answer. But I also knew that love had to be more than presence. It had to be truth. I could not teach him to accept abuse by example. Time stretched, and with it came a strange healing. The scar on my arm faded into a pale reminder, not a burning wound. I took long walks into the forest and learned the names of wildflowers again. Isabel visited often, her laughter filling the cottage with something like youth. We spoke about our past, about nursing shifts that felt endless, about husbands lost and children grown. She told me my story was not mine alone. Countless women were silenced by the families they built. Countless women had deeds in their names, but no recognition in their homes. She said the haven could be more than a house. It could be a beacon. I watched as word spread. Neighbors brought donations, local carpenters volunteered repairs, even the town's mayor came to shake my hand. For the first time in years, people looked at me and saw not a burden, but a builder. One afternoon, I drove to Port Blossom and parked outside the old house. The sign I had carved hung proudly, weathered slightly by rain. In the window, I saw movement, 2 women sitting at the table with cups of tea, speaking quietly, their shoulders relaxed. It was the same table where I had been relegated to the corner, the same chairs that once excluded me. I realized I no longer carried the weight of those memories. They belonged to another life, another woman. The house no longer spoke of pain. It whispered resilience. I walked back to my car with a strange peace. You cannot always erase scars, but you can decide what they will stand for. The seasons turned. The garden at the cottage bloomed. Letters from women at the haven reached me, each one a testimony of survival. A woman who had escaped a son's gambling debts, another who left an abusive marriage after decades of silence, a grandmother reunited with her grandchildren after finding the courage to stand. They called me brave. I never felt brave. I felt necessary. I had simply chosen not to disappear. I had chosen to exist fully, not as a shadow in my own home. Each story reminded me that a single act of reclamation can ripple outward into countless lives. On the anniversary of Arthur's death, I sat on the porch swing. I finally hung myself and watched the sunset bleed through the cedars. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, of endings and beginnings woven together. I thought of Julian then, not with anger, but with sorrow, the kind that lingers like smoke. I hoped someday he would understand, that Arya would grow up and seek me out, that the cycle of silence would break. But I also knew I could not wait for apologies that might never come. My life had already begun again. The lesson etched into my skin, into every page of those deeds, was simple: love without respect is not love, and endurance without boundaries is not strength. A woman can be told to leave a house, but no one can evict her from the truth of who she is. The second winter in Cedar Creek settled in quietly, snow dusting the cedar branches and muffling the world into stillness. I had grown accustomed to the rhythm of solitude, the long mornings when the fog clung low, and the evenings when the fire in the hearth crackled like an old companion. The scars on my arm itched in the cold, but they no longer defined me. What defined me now were the choices I made each day to plant seeds, to cook meals for myself, with care to read, until the words filled me instead of passing time. And above all, to keep the haven alive. The house in Port Blossom had transformed beyond recognition. What was once a stage for cruelty had become a shelter for grace. Women arrived with stories carved into their faces, some betrayed by children, some by husbands, some simply discarded when their usefulness was deemed spent. I visited often not to manage, but to witness, to sit at the table and sip tea, while laughter returned to rooms that had once echoed with Chloe's disdain. Each woman who passed through reminded me that healing was not linear, that sometimes strength was found in the simple act of sleeping through the night without fear. I watched as one woman learned to bake again after decades of being forbidden from the kitchen. Another planted flowers in the yard and whispered to them as if they were confidants. They carried their pain differently than I carried mine, but together we created a tapestry of survival, each thread stubborn and shining. Julian's absence became a strange silence in itself. He never came to the haven, never reached for me again, at least not directly. Once, while in town for groceries, I overheard a conversation at the market, someone whispering that Julian and Chloe had left the county, their debts and bitterness chasing them elsewhere. My chest tightened at the thought of Arya caught in the slipstream of their choices, but I held on to faith that life would one day lead him back to me. I had learned not to chase what was not ready to be found. Instead, I poured my energy into those who stood before me, into the women who needed to see someone survive and not just endure. Isabel remained by my side visiting when cases allowed, her sharp eyes always taking in more than I said aloud. She helped formalize the haven into a legal trust, ensuring that no one could ever dismantle it, not even me on a day of weakness. She said this was how legacies were built, not through monuments, but through continuity, through ensuring that kindness was structured strong enough to outlive us. I listened and signed the papers with steady hands, realizing that the home Arthur and I once built had taken on a second life, one we could never have predicted. There were nights, however, when doubt slithered in. Alone in the cottage, I would wonder if I had gone too far, if evicting my son had been an unforgivable act that history would judge harshly. But then I would remember the saucepan tipping, the cold impatience in his eyes, the sneer curling Chloe's lips. I would remember the way my grandson had sat silent and trembling, watching cruelty unfold as if it were routine. And I knew then that I had not overreacted. I had acted at last. One spring morning, a letter arrived at the haven addressed to me. The handwriting was clumsy, uneven, but instantly familiar. My hands trembled as I tore the envelope open. Inside was a short note, just a few lines written in a child's uncertain scrawl. "Grandma, I miss you. I don't know why we can't see you. I hope you are okay. I love you." It was signed with Arya's name and a small drawing of a house with a crooked roof and smoke rising from the chimney. My tears fell fast and hot onto the paper. The return address was a P.O. box in another state, no details beyond that, but it was enough. He remembered. He reached out. He still knew me even if his parents tried to erase me. That letter became my talisman. I tucked it into the portfolio with the deeds, a reminder that not all connections can be severed. Blood may fail, but love once planted has roots that even betrayal cannot rip free. I wrote back, sending the letter through the P.O. box, unsure if it would ever reach him, telling him that I was safe, that I loved him, that the world was wide, and he would never be alone in it. I signed it simply, Grandma Eleanor. The seasons turned again. The haven grew, its rooms filled and emptied as women came and healed and left to start anew. Some wrote letters back to me, stories of small apartments they now called their own jobs they had taken, grandchildren they had reconciled with. One woman even sent me a photograph of herself, standing on the porch of a modest new home, smiling with a pride that lit her entire face. I pinned that photo to the cottage wall, a reminder that the story I lived had not ended, but multiplied. I had become something I never expected, a matriarch, not of blood, but of choice of women who chose to rise. My kitchen table became a place of counsel, my porch swing a confessional, my hands steady, not just for myself, but for those who came trembling. Sometimes I caught sight of myself in the mirror and saw not the weary old woman Julian dismissed, but a survivor, a builder, a storm that had cleared the air for others to breathe. And yet, in quiet moments, I still thought of Julian. I wondered if he hated me, or if in secret moments of honesty he understood. I wondered if Chloe still sneered at the mention of my name, or if her bitterness had turned inward, souring her own spirit. I wondered most of all about Arya, if he would keep writing, if he would someday stand on my porch as a man and ask me to tell him the truth. If that day came, I would. I would not varnish the past, but I would show him what became of it, the women who healed under his grandmother's roof, the sanctuary carved from cruelty, the proof that endings could be beginnings in disguise. Every scar tells a story. Mine told of fire, betrayal, and exile, but also of rebirth, defiance, and purpose. I had been discarded, and I chose to become a refuge. I had been silenced, and I chose to become a voice. I had been told to die elsewhere, and instead, I chose to live fully here. On the evening of my 71st birthday, I sat at the table in the Haven, surrounded by women who had once been strangers but now felt like sisters. They sang to me, their voices imperfect and warm, a chorus stitched together from survival. There was a cake lopsided and sweet baked by one of the women who had never been allowed to bake for her own family. I blew out the candles, the room erupting in laughter, and for the first time in decades, I wished for nothing more than what I already had. The candles flickered out on my 71st birthday, and as the smoke curled into the air, I felt a truth settle into my bones. I had not been destroyed. I had been remade. The women around me, voices cracked, but strong faces lined with experience, were not simply companions, they were evidence. Evidence that even the most broken homes can be reborn into sanctuaries, that pain can compost into nourishment for something new. They clapped and laughed and pressed slices of cake into my hands, and I realized that this was the family I had longed for, not one bound by duty or expectation, but one chosen in defiance of cruelty. The weeks after that birthday carried a quiet grace. Spring pushed into summer, wild rhododendrons exploding around the cottage, in blooms so vivid they looked painted. The Haven thrived. Women came and went, each leaving behind a trace of themselves, an embroidered pillowcase, a painted mug, a note folded and tucked into a drawer. These artifacts accumulated into a mosaic of resilience. Sometimes I walked through those rooms and touched the things left behind, marveling at how what was once my prison had become a wellspring for others. Each story added to the weight of my purpose, proof that my eviction of Julian and Chloe had not been an act of vengeance, but a reclamation of dignity. Still, the ache of my son lingered. Some nights I sat on the porch and watched the stars prickle through the dark sky, wondering if he ever thought of me beyond his anger. I remembered the boy who once ran to me with bleeding knees, who once buried his face in my apron after nightmares. That boy was gone, lost in a man who had mistaken cruelty for strength and convenience for love. Yet I also knew that memory cannot be burned out as easily as skin can be scarred. Perhaps one day the echoes of who he had been would lead him back. Until then, I kept the door of my heart open, but the locks on my boundaries firm. Arya's letter remained my most treasured possession. Each time I reread the crooked scrawl, I heard the tremor of hope in his words. I answered each note that came through the P.O. box, never sure if my replies reached him, but writing anyway, because truth must be spoken even into silence. I told him stories of the garden of the women who had found safety of the sunsets bleeding orange and violet across the cedars. I told him he came from a line of resilience that no cruelty could erase his capacity to choose kindness. Those letters became a thread between us, invisible but unbreakable. By autumn, the haven had become known beyond Port Blossom. A small article in the county paper described it as a sanctuary for women written off by the world, founded by one who refused to be erased. The words embarrassed me at first, but then I saw how they carried. Donations arrived. Volunteers offered help. A retired teacher began hosting literacy classes in the living room. A local carpenter built sturdy bunk beds in the upstairs rooms. What had begun as an act of reclamation grew into a movement I could hardly recognize as my own, and yet it was. Each brick in the foundation, each line in the deed, each scar on my arm, all had conspired to create this. One evening, Isabel sat with me on the porch, swing her legal pad closed for once, her silver hair catching the last light of day. She said, "Ellie, do you see what you've done? You've turned survival into a legacy." I looked at her, at the cottage, at the garden pulsing with color, and finally at the horizon, where the cedars reached skyward. A long breath left me, and I admitted I hadn't set out to build a legacy. I had only wanted to survive. She smiled and told me that sometimes survival is the most radical legacy of all. The lesson that burned itself into me was simple, though not easy. Silence is not love, and endurance is not the same as strength. For too long, I had believed that keeping the peace meant keeping my place in the family. But peace built on erasure is only another form of violence. The day I walked out of my son's house with the deed in my hand, I chose not just freedom, but truth. And truth, once chosen, multiplies. It multiplies in women who laugh again around a kitchen table. It multiplies in letters written by a grandson who refuses to forget. It multiplies in every corner of the haven where healing breathes. Now, when I pass the carved redwood sign at the gate, I feel no sorrow for what I lost. I feel pride for what I created. They wanted me gone, and I went, but not empty-handed, not broken. I took the roof and gave it to others. I transformed insult into inheritance, cruelty into care. And in doing so, I came home to myself. If my story reaches you, let it carry this: no one can evict you from your worth. You may be cast aside, silenced, made small, but inside you lies a deed, written in your own name, proof that you belong. Do not wait for permission to claim it. Do not confuse sacrifice with surrender. Stand tall even if you tremble. Protect your own flame, and when you can, use it to light the path for others. Thank you for walking with me through my story. If it moved you, please like, share, subscribe, and comment, so others can find their own strength through these words.